Well, last week I was outside and something that doesn't happen very often in the winter in Wisconsin occurred. The clouds parted and the sun came out. And as the sun, it was just a beautiful day and the sun was shining. And as the sun hit the snow and the ice of where we were, it was painful to my eyes. And there were a bunch of other people around. I'm trying to shield my eyes just because of how bright it was as the sunlight was being reflected off the snow and off the ice. And I'm kind of shielding my eyes a little bit, and I'm looking around, and everybody else is looking just fine. They're not having a problem with it, but my eyes needed a minute to adjust because of how bright it was all around us. It reminded me of a time when I was a child. We went to a matinee movie, and in those days at this theater, when the movie was over, you would just walk out the doors of the theater and they would take you directly into a parking lot. You wouldn't have to walk back through the lobby. And so as the movie ended, I was the first one, and I opened up the door, and the light from the sun hit me from the dark theater, and I just stopped right where I was in the sidewalk, and my sister was behind me, and she plowed into me, and she's like, "You gotta move!" And then we started fighting. She's always been a very mean person, and I suffered a lot growing up, and we just started fighting then because I was blinded, and so I just stopped moving and stood right in front of where the door was because it was so bright. And I don't know if you've ever been in a situation or a circumstance like that where we just have a drastic change in light, but it's something that can disorient you. It's something that can make it difficult as your eyes adjust. Over the course of the last couple months, we've been journeying through the book of Mark together, and today we're going to continue that journey, and we're going to see God do something supernatural and something incredible, but it's going to be hard for us to describe, and it's going to be hard for us to fully put into words exactly what happened, but the implications of it are very practical for our lives. If you have your phones or your tablets, I'd invite you to follow along with us this morning in the Bible app. It's a free resource that you can find in whatever app store you utilize on your device. And once you have the Bible app installed on your device, there's a feature that we use together each and every week, and that's called the Events feature. You go to the Events feature and either enable your locations or write in Lakeside, Algoma will pop up, and you can follow along with us that way. If you have a traditional Bible with you, again, we are journeying through the book of Mark. Mark is the second book of the New Testament, the second gospel. Matthew, Mark. We're going to be in chapter 9 today, Mark chapter 9. And if you're joining us via the stream this morning, thanks so much for joining us. My name is Brian. I'm part of the team here at Lakeside, and the verse will be available for you on the screen below. Now, last week, as we looked at Mark chapter 8, we saw a message that Jesus gave to his disciples. And Jesus told his disciples, if you want to follow me, this is what that's going to look like. If you want to follow me, you have to deny yourself. You have to deny the things that you want to do, and you have to not do those things. Deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow after me. That is the message that Jesus gave to his disciples last week, that if you want to follow after Jesus, you're going to have to deny yourself, and you're going to have to take up your cross, which means you're going to have to not do some of the things that you want to have to do, or that you want to do, and you're going to have to suffer in some regards as a result of following Jesus. And it's with that context that we now jump into Mark chapter 9, beginning in verse 2, where we read these words. And after 6 days, Jesus took with him Peter and James and John and led them up a high mountain by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his clothes became radiant, intensely white, as no one on earth could bleach them. So 6 days after giving all the disciples the message that if you're going to come after me, you've got to deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow me daily, Jesus now, 6 days later, takes just a handful of disciples, just the closest disciples with him, the three, Peter, James, and John. Jesus, with the three closest disciples that he is, Peter, James, and John, they go up top of a mountain. And as they're on top of this mountain, something supernatural and spiritual happens, and we can't adequately describe it or explain it. But as Mark records for us, Jesus is transfigured. Now, if you're unclear of what transfigured implies, it's essentially the same thing as being transformed, but it's being transformed in a different degree. It's being transformed with an exalted spiritual appearance. That's what it means to be transfigured. And that is what happens to Jesus. And Mark records for us that he becomes radiant. It is more intensely white than anyone had ever seen before, such as no one on earth. If you had all the bleach in the world and you put a garment in all the bleach in the world, you still couldn't get it to be as intensely white as the appearance of Jesus was when he was transfigured. So just this incredible, supernatural, spiritual scene that we can't adequately describe or fully wrap our minds around, but this is what the disciples saw as they were on top of that mountain. And there appeared to them Elijah with Moses, and they were talking with Jesus. So not only does Jesus transfigure and become radiant, glowing, whiter white than the world had ever seen before or that they could ever come up with again, not only that, but as this is going on, now somehow, supernaturally, Elijah and Moses are there, and they're talking with Jesus. I mean, just an incredible scene. Now remember, we've already been introduced to Elijah at a couple other points in the book of Mark. Mark chapter 6 as well as Mark chapter 8. Some people, when they're trying to wrap their minds around who Jesus is, as they've seen him perform miracles, as they've heard him teach with authority, as they're trying to figure out who Jesus is, they've come up with all different kinds of answers. And some people say, this is Elijah, who God has sent back. This is Elijah on display. And other people say, no. He's not Elijah, but Jesus is like Elijah. He's in the same vein as Elijah, but he's not actually Elijah, but he's a lot like Elijah. Elijah was an incredible prophet from the Old Testament, and Moses, when you think about people who accomplish great things for God's glory throughout the Old Testament, Moses is either at the top of that list or right there amongst whoever is at the top of your list, who God used to go and to tell Pharaoh to let the Israelites go. And Pharaoh said, okay, only to say, never mind, I'm not going to let them go. And there was a back and forth with all of the plagues. And finally, Pharaoh says, go. And Moses leads his people and out of Egypt. And then Pharaoh regrets that decision. They go charging after them, and God supernaturally, miraculously parts the sea. They walk through it. Then the Israelites start to grumble as they're on the journey to the promised land. They say it was better for us in captivity back in Egypt. And so Moses has to lead all of these people through the wilderness through a period of 40 years where they experienced some incredible things, and he experienced a lot of grumbling and complaining as well. But these are two spiritual giants who are there having a conversation with Jesus. God just somehow supernaturally pulls back the spiritual curtain, and the disciples who are there, Peter, James, and John, see Jesus, who is glowing, radiant, intensely white, with this conversation happening with Elijah and Moses. And Peter said to Jesus, Rabbi, it is good that we are here. Let us make 3 tents, one for you and one for Moses and one for Elijah. So Peter, James, and John are seeing this, and I don't know how you respond to that, and they don't either. And so Peter's like, Jesus, this is a good thing. This is good. Let me build you some tents. Let me build you and Elijah and Moses a tent. That's what Peter comes up with as he's seeing this unfold. And then we get to verse 6. For he did not know what to say, for they were terrified. They're freaking out when they see this. And so Peter just word vomits tents. I'll build you some tents. Tents are a good thing. Let's do tents. This is good because he is freaking out. He's freaking out. And this is a reminder to us that sometimes God blows our minds. And sometimes God works in truly extraordinary ways. And sometimes God does incredible things. But we don't always know how God is going to act. We don't always know how God is going to work. We don't always know the things and the ways that God is going to do things and the ways that he is going to act in certain situations, certain scenarios. And so here are Peter, James, and John, and they are given this incredible, supernatural glimpse of something that we can't fully explain. And their response is one of terror. They are terrified. Sometimes God is going to lead us to places. God led them there. Sometimes God is going to lead us places that leave us frightened. Sometimes God is going to call us to go places and do things and witness things that God is working in. And they're going to terrify us. Following God does not guarantee a life of ease. It does not guarantee a life of safety. And those are things that we highly value as a culture. Those are things that we strive for. And yet what we have to recognize is sometimes God calls us to go places that are dangerous. Sometimes God calls us to do things that don't seemingly make all that much sense on the surface. Sometimes God leads us places and it's beyond us. And our response in those instances and in those moments is the same response that Peter has here. We're probably not going to word vomit, hey, God, I'll make you some tents. But we're going to be terrified. And if we're frightened and if we're terrified and if we're uncomfortable, it doesn't mean that there's a lack of the presence of God. Sometimes God calls us to go places that are intentionally going to make us uncomfortable. Sometimes God calls us to go places that are designed to terrify us. Peter, James, and John are witnessing something absolutely incredible, and they are all terrified as a result. And a cloud overshadowed them, and a voice came out of the cloud, "This is my beloved Son, listen to him." An announcement from heaven comes down. And suddenly looking around, they no longer saw anyone with them but Jesus only. And as they were coming down the mountain, he charged them to tell no one what they had seen until the Son of Man had risen from the dead. So they kept the matter to themselves, questioning what this rising from the dead might mean. Jesus again tells them to keep quiet. He tells them to keep quiet. Now, this is not a new theme that we've seen. In fact, we've seen this theme unfold repeatedly throughout the book of Mark. That as Jesus does something miraculous or he does the supernatural, he then withdraws to the disciples and he tells them, hey, what you just saw, don't talk about. The time isn't ready yet. We're not going to talk about that yet. And at places we've paused and we've wrestled with this. Why would God do the miraculous? Why would God do the supernatural and then say, hey, let's not talk about that right now? And we've seen, well, in one instance, it was because he had a greater purpose. And we've seen at other times, what we're going to see unfold here as well, that it's an opportunity for Jesus to use this to provide the disciples with greater spiritual understanding. And that's what's about to unfold here. I mean, think about it. If you witness this, if you're on top of a mountain with Jesus, you're one of the three disciples that gets to go with Jesus on top of the mountain, and you're there, and all of a sudden he transfigures, and then right in front of your very eyes are Moses and Elijah. Well, first of all, good luck explaining that to somebody anyways, but what do you even say? What do you even say? And they asked him, verse 11 tells us, why do the scribes say that first Elijah must come? And he said to them, Elijah does come first to restore all things. And how is it written of the Son of Man that he should suffer many things and be treated with contempt? But I tell you that Elijah has come, and they did to him whatever they pleased, as it is written of him. Now, we don't have time to look at all of the incredible things that Elijah accomplished through his ministry. We don't have time to look at Moses' entire legacy. But let's just pause here and think about this for a moment. We'll start with Moses. In Moses is the person that God used to rescue the Israelites from a reality of slavery, abandon the country where they were enslaved, to lead them to a land that God had promised them. That is all things that God accomplished through Moses. And yet, Moses was not permitted to enter the promised land. Why? Because of his sin at Moriah. When he struck the rock. So God made it that Moses, who had some incredible victories and accomplished some amazing things as a spiritual leader, also had a very public flaw. Committed some very public sins. One of them cost him the opportunity to go into the promised land. So he got to look over it. But he was never permitted to enter into the promised land because of a very public failing that he had. What about Elijah? Elijah, who God used to proclaim a number of incredibly powerful messages, finds himself so discouraged in 1 Kings chapter 19. He says, I just want to die. God, take me out. Experienced so much defeat and so much disappointment that the prevailing emotion and thought that he had was it would be better for me to be dead than to continue on in what you have called me to do. Two spiritual giants. Two people who accomplished so much for the glory of God. And two people with very real limitations. And two people with very real and public flaws. And there they are, having a conversation with Jesus. In the sight of three disciples, they're having this conversation. And what does this say to us? Well, first, in Jesus is the completion. He is full divinity and full humanity on display. In Jesus, there is no flaw and there is no limitation. And He lives up to the standard that Moses could not meet. And He lives up to the standard that Elijah could not meet. And He lives up to the standard that you and I cannot meet. The standard of the fullness of God, the standard of full perfection on display in divinity and humanity. And the conversation He has are, yes, with two spiritual giants, but two spiritual giants with very real limitations and very real flaws. And because of what Jesus would be accomplishing, because of what Jesus came to do, that the same access of Moses and Elijah that they have to God is the access we now enjoy with God in spite of our limitations, in spite of our flaws, in spite of our sin. That God, when we put our faith and trust in Christ, does not look at us and see every mistake and every flaw and every failure and every limitation and every sin that we have. But He invites us into His presence through the completed work of Christ. In the same way that Elijah and Moses were invited into his presence. And when they came to the disciples, they saw a great crowd around them and scribes arguing with them, and immediately all the crowd, when they saw him, were greatly amazed and ran up to him and greeted him, and he asked them, "What are you arguing about with them?" So now Jesus, Peter, James, and John are climbing down the mountain. And they come to where the rest of the disciples are, and they are now arguing with the scribes. We've seen the scribes, as the book of Mark has progressed, they originally started with loaded questions, and now they've just dropped that pretense, and it's just straight arguments. And that's what's going on here. There is an argument between the disciples and between the scribes. Jesus walks up to it and says, "What's this argument all about?" And someone from the crowd answered him, "Teacher, I brought my son to you, for he has a spirit that makes him mute. And whenever it seizes him, it throws him down, and he foams and grinds his teeth and becomes rigid. So I asked your disciples to cast it out, and they were not able." So the disciples and the scribes are arguing about a situation where there is a man who's introduced, and this man's in need. He has a need. And his need is he has a son who he's not able to help. His son is possessed by a demon, and he's not able to speak. So I think one of the questions we have to ask is, does this mean that everybody who's unable to speak is it's a result of demon possession? And the answer to that question is no. There are medical conditions as a result of living in a broken and a flawed world that aren't related to demonic undercurrents and don't really have a driving spiritual element to them at all. Sometimes it's just the result of living in a broken and a flawed world. But sometimes, as we see here, demons can and they do attack in a medical way. And that's what's going on here. And they're torturing this poor boy. And as any parent knows, it's the worst feeling in the world when you see your child in pain and you aren't able to help. You flash back to a simpler time in life when they were in pain and all they needed was a Band-Aid or a kiss and they were good to go. But life gets more complicated and more challenging than that. And the Band-Aids and the kisses no longer work. And that's the angst and the anguish that this man's facing. As day in and day out, he sees his son. And he sees him suffer. And he wants nothing more than just to be able to talk to his child. And every day is a roller coaster. Every day is a reminder of the limitations and the situation that this poor boy is enduring. And he answered them, "O faithless generation, how long am I to be with you? How long am I to bear with you? Bring him to me." Now, Jesus' response might sound callous on the surface. That here is this heartbroken man, and the response of Jesus is, "O faithless generation." But what Jesus is actually articulating here is the fact that his heart is broken. His heart is broken by this encounter. His heart is broken by everything this man and his son are enduring and everything they're going through. His heart is broken by the disciples' inability to intervene and to help in this instant. And they brought the boy to him, and when the spirit saw him, immediately it convulsed the boy. And he fell on the ground and rolled about foaming at the mouth. And Jesus asked his father, "How long has this been happening to him?" And he said, "From childhood. And it has often cast him into fire and into water to destroy him. But if you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us." Now, we just talked about whether every medical situation is a result of demonic undercurrents or demonic possession. And certainly the answer to that is no. So then the question might be, well, how do we know? if demons can attack that way, and if not every medical need and every medical situation is a result of demonic occurrence, then what are the telltale signs? How do we know if there's a greater spiritual dynamic or problem going on? And I would just say that a telling sign of demonic oppression is direct and repeated harm and behaviors that are done directly and intentionally to lead to that. Here we're told that the demons are causing this kid to throw himself onto fire repeatedly. They're causing him to throw himself into water to attempt to be drowned. Mark 5 was another case of this. Mark chapter 5, we saw another individual who was possessed by demons. And there was purposeful, repeated, self-inflicted harm. And so that would be one of the telltale signs that there very well may be more than just a medical situation going on. And Jesus said to him, verse 23 tells us, if you can, all things are possible for one who believes. All things are possible for one who believes. What Jesus is saying here is this, that faith is essential in accessing the power of God. Faith is essential in accessing the power of God. And sometimes we can go through the motions. Sometimes we can do all of these things. But the question we have to ask ourselves is, are we doing these things in faith? We can go through all the motions, we can do the spiritual disciplines, but if all it is a routine, and all it is habit, and faith isn't the driving factor behind it, then it's empty. And there's no power there. I was rearranging some things in my office at home, and the way I have everything laid out, the main plug that I need is behind my desk, and there's no good way to get to it. And I'm not sure if it was a building design that the builder should have put the outlet somewhere else, or a room design thing where I've placed everything, but I've placed everything that way, so it's the builder's fault. And I'm like, all right, I've got to drag the desk out, and I've got to rearrange some things. That's fine. So I do. I drag the desk out, and it's not something that I like to do, but I drag the desk out, and I get everything situated in the way that I want it situated, and I move the desk back, and I'm like, all right. And I turn my computer on, and nothing. I'm like, well, that's less than ideal. So I guess what I'll do is I'm gonna turn the speaker on, and I'll play some music through the speaker while I troubleshoot why the computer's not working now. And I go to turn the speaker on, and it doesn't want to work either. I trace the lines, and everything's plugged into the power strip. But there's that little button on the power strip that if you don't turn it on, no power is going to go through. And faith is that button that allows us to access the power of God. And might I suggest to you that it is possible to pray and to read Scripture and to go through all the routines, but to be doing it because it's routine. And not because it's actually an expression of our faith. And immediately, the father of the child cried out and said, I believe, help my unbelief. The father hears Jesus' response, and the father cries out to Jesus, Jesus, I do believe, but you got to help me, because I believe you. But I've been in the fire pulling my son out. Jesus, I believe you, but I've gone running into the river, and I've found him face down as he's almost drowned. Jesus, I believe you, but I want to hear him talk. Jesus, I believe you, but you got to help me. Because day after day after day, we're walking through this. And my boy isn't better. And I need you, Jesus. I do believe, but you got to help me with my unbelief. And I wonder if that's a prayer that we need to pray, because what can happen is we feel like, hey, if I show up at church, I got to appear like I got it all together. And while we really hope you don't really think that, we understand it if you do. And we hope you don't feel like you have to act that way here, but we understand it if you do. But even worse than that is when we pretend we have it all together directly with God. We think, I know the doubts that are plaguing my mind. I know the uncertainty, but I can't admit that. I just want to remind you, God already knows. You don't have to put on a performance. And the Father cries out, Jesus, I do believe, but you got to help me with my unbelief. And if you find yourself there today, don't run from it, lean into it. And you utter that same prayer that the Father did. And when Jesus saw that a crowd came running together, he rebuked the unclean spirit, saying to it, you mute and deaf spirit, I command you, come out of him and never enter him again. And after crying out and convulsing him terribly, it came out, and the boy was like a corpse, so that most of them said, he is dead. But Jesus took him by the hand and lifted him up, and he arose. Jesus rebuked the demon and commands it to leave the boy, and the boy appears dead. Now make no mistake, the demon listened, but the boy appears dead. He convulses violently, the text tells us. Make no mistake, God is greater. God is greater, but the enemy is still going to do everything he can to harm you. And as people see this scene unfold, they look at the boy that Jesus has just cast the demon out of, and their response is, he's dead. That's what he just went through. The enemy comes to steal, to kill, and to destroy. And ultimately, God is greater, but you do yourself a disservice if you do not recognize that there is a very real enemy. And much of it happens in the unseen spiritual realm, but there is a very real enemy who does everything he can to destroy you. And yes, God is greater, but here Jesus casts the demon out, and the boy convulses so violently in the process, people think he's dead. And when he had entered the house, his disciples asked him privately, why could we not cast it out? And he said to them, this kind cannot be driven out by anything but prayer. The disciples have just seen the scene unfold, and they asked Jesus, why couldn't we do it? Why weren't we able to do that? Why weren't we able to solve this problem? And we could spend months or years talking about the implications of this verse, but Jesus just says, this kind can only be driven out through prayer. Now, he doesn't go on and describe that. He doesn't give us all the details. He just leaves it at that. And I wish we knew more, but here is what we know with certainty, that there is immense power in prayer. And with that being the case, and this being the response of Jesus, I am imploring you to make prayer a priority in your life. I'm asking you to make prayer the primary posture of your life, so that we all talk about, it's important to have a plan. And it is. It's important to have a plan. But before you develop a plan, start to pray. And make that the habit that you get into. that before you're going to plan anything, the very first thing you're going to do is you're going to pray. And that is what's going to drive you. Not that you're going to plan and not that you're going to make all of these decisions, and then when everything blows up or everything doesn't work out, then as a last resort, go to prayer. Shift it. Make prayer your primary posture. Make it where you start things, not where you end. There's incredible power there. 3 disciples were on top of a mountain, and they saw something truly supernatural, truly spiritual. Where Elijah and Moses, 2 giants of the faith, with flawed and imperfect histories, are talking to Jesus. And they come down the mountain and they see this boy whose story is tragic. And they see it forever altered and forever changed as a result of an encounter with Jesus. But when they were on top of the mountain, they were terrified. They didn't know what to say. And when they walk down the mountain and they see Jesus work, the crowd is terrified. Because they think the boy is dead. The reality is this. God is going to call you places. God is going to ask you to go some places. God is going to lead you to things. God is going to show you some things. And you aren't going to feel safe. And the call of Jesus is that we would deny ourselves, take up our cross, and follow Him. And what that means is sometimes God's going to lead us to places that are uncomfortable, and sometimes we're going to be terrified out of our minds. But God is greater. And my hope and my prayer is that you'll be willing to go. God, help us. Go to the places you call us to go. Do the things you call us to do. God, I pray for the people right now who find themselves in the midst of a situation and a circumstance where they feel things are happening all around them outside of their control. Pray for people who are in the midst of a situation with somebody that they love and they want to fix it, but God, it just for whatever reason isn't being fixed. And God, they know you can work, but they're struggling. Because in spite of their prayers and in spite of their attempts, you haven't answered the prayer the way they think you should. And I pray, God, that they wouldn't hide. I pray that they wouldn't feel like they can't be honest about that. And I pray for all of us, God. We would be willing to go where you call us to go and do what you call us to do. Be honored and glorified through the lives we lead. It's in your Son, Jesus' name we pray. Amen.